It was a bright and sunny afternoon in the city park. Maya, a 12-year-old girl with a love for art, sat on a green bench near the playground. Her sketchbook rested on her lap as she drew the tall oak trees swaying in the breeze. She felt happy and peaceful, unaware of the trouble that was about to unfold. Maya's father, Captain James Harper, was a well-known and respected police captain in the city. He was attending an important meeting at the nearby police station, leaving Maya at the park for a short while. She was used to being independent and knew her father would return soon. As Maya sketched, a police officer in a crisp blue uniform walked by. His name was Officer Grant. He noticed Maya sitting alone and decided to approach her. At first, he smiled warmly and asked what she was drawing. Maya, always polite, showed him her sketch and explained her love for art. Grant nodded and complimented her work, but his tone felt overly familiar. The conversation started harmlessly, but Maya soon began to feel uneasy. Grant started asking personal questions: where she lived, who she was with, and why she was alone. Maya hesitated to answer, sensing that something wasn't right. She looked around the park, hoping someone would notice her discomfort. Grant sat down beside her on the bench, his presence suddenly feeling overwhelming. "You're very talented," he said, placing a hand on the edge of her sketchbook. Maya nodded politely, trying to focus on her drawing and ignore the growing sense of unease. As the minutes passed, Grant's behavior became more intrusive. He leaned closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be shy," he said. Maya froze, unsure of what to do. She wanted to get up and leave, but her fear held her in place. Across the park, a few people noticed the interaction but weren't sure what to make of it. Some assumed the officer was simply being friendly, while others felt something was off. No one intervened, leaving Maya to handle the situation alone. "I should go," Maya said, standing up and clutching her sketchbook. But Grant gently grabbed her arm, his smile fading into something more unsettling. "Why leave so soon?" he asked, his tone too firm. At that moment, a familiar figure emerged from the path leading to the park. It was Captain Harper, returning from his meeting. He spotted Maya on the bench and froze. Something about her posture and the officer's proximity didn't sit right with him. As Harper walked closer, his sharp eyes took in the scene, and anger bubbled inside him. Maya looked up and saw her father approaching. Relief washed over her, and she quickly pulled her arm away from Grant. Harper's commanding voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the park. Grant turned, his face pale, as he realized who had just arrived. Captain Harper's voice echoed through the park like a thunderclap. His tall, commanding figure strode toward the bench where his daughter stood. Maya's wide eyes locked onto his, a mix of relief and fear in her expression. The officer sitting next to her, Officer Grant, immediately straightened up, realizing that trouble had just arrived. "Dad," Maya called, her voice trembling. She ran toward her father, clutching her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Harper knelt down and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, scanning her face for any sign of distress. Maya nodded but didn't speak. Her father's presence had already made her feel safer, but the tension in the air was still thick. Captain Harper looked over her shoulder at Grant, who was now awkwardly standing by the bench, his face red and his demeanor stiff. "What exactly were you doing here?" Harper's tone was sharp, and his piercing eyes fixed on Grant. The officer stammered, trying to find the right words. I was just talking to her," Grant said, attempting to sound casual. "She looked like she was alone, so I thought I'd check on her." Captain Harper's expression darkened. He could sense there was more to the story, and the unease in Maya's body language confirmed it. "Talking, huh?" Harper said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "And what part of talking made her so uncomfortable?" Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Harper held up a hand to silence him. "Save it," he said coldly. "Maya, tell me what happened." Maya hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at Grant before turning back to her father. He kept asking me questions, she said quietly. Personal questions. And then he put his hand on my shoulder and wouldn't let me leave. Harper's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. He stood up straight, his eyes never leaving Grant. The officer shuffled his feet nervously, clearly uncomfortable under the captain's intense gaze. "You touched my daughter without her consent." Harper's voice was low and steady, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. Grant stammered, trying to defend himself. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just being friendly, that's all." "Friendly?" Harper's tone turned icy. "Friendly doesn't make a 12-year-old girl afraid to move." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. People whispered among themselves, some taking out their phones to record the scene. Harper ignored them, his focus solely on protecting his daughter and holding the officer accountable. Harper pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "This is Captain Harper," he said into the receiver. "I need backup at the city park immediately. We have a situation." Grant's face turned pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had crossed the line, and now he was about to face the consequences. Harper placed a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. "You're safe now," he told her gently. "I promise." The crowd around the park began to grow, their murmurs filling the air as they watched the scene unfold. Captain Harper kept a protective arm around Maya, standing tall and unwavering. His eyes never left Officer Grant, whose once confident demeanor had crumbled into panic. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone could feel it. Within minutes, 2 police cars arrived, their sirens briefly blaring before coming to a stop. Officers stepped out, looking confused as they noticed Captain Harper at the center of the commotion. One of them, Officer Lopes, approached cautiously, her hand resting on her radio. "Captain Harper," Lopes said, clearly surprised. "What's going on here?" Harper didn't hesitate. "This officer," he said, pointing directly at Grant, "approached my daughter without cause, asked her inappropriate questions, and put his hands on her without her consent. I want this dealt with immediately." Lopez's eyes widened as she glanced between Harper, Maya, and Grant. "Is this true?" she asked, turning to Grant, who was visibly sweating. "It's a misunderstanding," Grant mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I was just being friendly, making sure she was okay." Harper's voice was calm but firm as he spoke again. "Friendly doesn't involve holding a child's arm or making her feel unsafe. Maya told me exactly what happened, and I trust her word over yours." Lopes nodded, sensing the seriousness of the situation. She gestured for another officer to step forward and take Grant aside. "We'll need to get statements," she said. "Captain Harper, we'll handle this according to protocol." As Grant was escorted away, the crowd murmured louder, some applauding Harper's actions while others looked on with curiosity. Harper knelt down beside Maya, his face softening as he spoke to her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked. Maya nodded, but her hands were still clutching her sketchbook tightly. "I'm okay now," she said quietly. "I was scared, but I knew you'd come." Harper's heart ached at her words, but he smiled gently and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were brave," he said, "and you did the right thing by telling me what happened." Lopes returned, her expression serious. "Captain, we've placed Officer Grant on suspension pending an investigation. We'll need your formal statement, as well as Maya's, to proceed." Harper nodded. "You'll have everything you need," he said. "But I want to make one thing clear. This behavior cannot and will not be tolerated in our department." Lopes agreed, her respect for Harper evident in her tone. "Understood, Captain. We'll ensure justice is served." As the officers wrapped up their work, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact of what they had witnessed lingered. Harper stood, holding Maya's hand as they prepared to leave the park. "Let's go home," he said softly to her. "You've been through enough today." Maya smiled faintly, feeling safe and proud to have a father who stood up for her no matter what. As Captain Harper walked hand in hand with Maya back to their car, his mind was racing. The events at the park weren't just about Maya. They were about something much bigger. He knew he had to protect his daughter, but he also had a duty to ensure such behavior would never happen again. Maya was his priority, but Harper couldn't ignore the responsibility that came with his position. Once they were home, Harper sat down with Maya in the living room. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, but she wasn't drawing. Instead, she sat quietly, her eyes focused on the floor. Harper placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maya," he said softly, "I need to know how you're feeling. It's okay to tell me if you're upset or scared." Maya looked up at him, her young face trying to hold back tears. "I was scared, Dad," she admitted, "but I knew you'd come. I just didn't understand why he wouldn't let me go." Harper's heart ached hearing her words. "What happened wasn't your fault," he assured her. "That officer was wrong, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable. No one has the right to make you feel unsafe." Maya nodded, her grip on the sketchbook loosening. "Thank you for coming, Dad," she whispered. "You never have to thank me for protecting you," Harper said, pulling her into a comforting hug. "That's what dads are for." Later that evening, Harper made a phone call to the precinct. He wanted to ensure the situation was being handled properly. Officer Lopes, who was leading the investigation, answered promptly. "Captain Harper," she said, "I've already started reviewing the reports and the witness statements. We're taking this very seriously." "I appreciate that, Lopes," Harper replied. "This isn't just about Maya. It's about setting an example. Officers like Grant shouldn't have a badge if they're going to abuse their power." Lopes agreed. "I've spoken with several witnesses, and their accounts align with Maya's. We're gathering all the evidence to ensure this is handled thoroughly." Harper felt a sense of relief, knowing the process was moving forward. "Thank you," he said. "Keep me updated." That night, as Harper tucked Maya into bed, she finally smiled again. "Can I go back to the park someday?" she asked hesitantly. Harper nodded. "Of course you can," he said. "The park is a place for you to enjoy, and I'll make sure it stays safe. You shouldn't have to be afraid." Maya's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Maya," Harper replied, kissing her forehead. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow is a new day." As he closed her bedroom door, Harper knew their lives had changed. But he also knew that standing up for justice wasn't just about one moment. It was about ensuring a better future for Maya and everyone else. The next morning, Captain Harper was back at work, but his mind lingered on the events of the previous day. He stood in his office, looking out the window as the city buzzed with life below. He knew the situation with Officer Grant wasn't just about his daughter. It was about accountability and trust. As a leader in the department, Harper had to ensure his team upheld the values they were sworn to protect. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Harper said, turning to see Officer Lopes step inside. She carried a folder and looked determined. "Captain, I gathered all the statements and reviewed the evidence," Lopes began. "There's no question. Officer Grant's actions were inappropriate and unacceptable." Harper nodded, taking the folder from her. He flipped through the pages, reading the detailed accounts from witnesses and Maya's statement. It was clear that Grant had overstepped his bounds, and there was no room for excuses. "Good work, Lopes," Harper said, closing the folder. "We need to proceed with disciplinary action immediately. This can't be brushed aside." Lopes agreed. "I've already notified the Internal Affairs team. Grant will face a formal hearing, and I've recommended his suspension become permanent." Harper appreciated her efficiency and dedication. "Thank you. Let's make sure this process is transparent. The public needs to see that we hold ourselves to the highest standards." As Lopes left, Harper sat at his desk and made a call to Maya. He wanted to check on her and let her know what was happening. "Hi, sweetheart," he said when she answered. "Hi, Dad," Maya replied, her voice brighter than it had been the day before. "I just wanted to let you know that the officer from yesterday is being held accountable," Harper said. "We're making sure he won't do this to anyone else." Maya sighed with relief. "Thank you, Dad. I'm glad you're doing something about it." "You're brave, Maya," Harper said. "Because you spoke up, we can make a difference." After the call, Harper felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But he was determined to use his position to create a safer environment for everyone, especially children like Maya. Later that afternoon, Harper held a meeting with his officers. He addressed the room with authority, his voice steady and clear. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable," he said. "We are here to serve and protect, not to intimidate or harm. If anyone in this department abuses their power, they will be held accountable. No exceptions." The room was silent as his words sank in. Harper looked around, meeting the eyes of each officer. "We have a responsibility to this community," he continued. "It's time we set the standard, not just for ourselves, but for every person we serve." As the meeting ended, Harper felt a sense of hope. He had taken the first step in turning a painful experience into an opportunity for growth and change, both for his team and his daughter. The following day, news of the incident involving Officer Grant began to spread through the department and the local community. Captain Harper's firm stance and swift action caught the attention of many, both inside and outside the police force. Harper knew the eyes of the public were now on him, and he had no intention of shying away from the responsibility. In the precinct, Officer Lopes approached Harper with an update. "Captain, the internal affairs hearing for Grant has been scheduled for tomorrow," she said. "The evidence is solid, and the witness statements back up Maya's account completely." Harper nodded. "That's good. This process needs to be fair and transparent, but it also needs to send a clear message. Officers like Grant don't belong on the force." Lopes hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sir, I wanted to say thank you. It's not every day we see leadership like this. It's inspiring to the rest of us." Harper appreciated her words, but felt the weight of the situation deeply. "Thank you, Lopes. This isn't just about me or my daughter. It's about doing what's right. For her, for the community, and for the department." Later that afternoon, Harper received an unexpected call from a community leader, Mrs. Evelyn Jones. She was known for her work in advocating for social justice and community police relations. "Captain Harper, I heard about what happened," Mrs. Jones said. "I wanted to thank you for taking this seriously and setting an example." "It's the least I can do," Harper replied. "But I know one case doesn't fix everything. There's still a lot of work to be done." "That's true," Mrs. Jones agreed. "But every step counts. I'd like to invite you to a community meeting next week to discuss ways we can improve trust between the police and the community." Harper didn't hesitate. "I'll be there. Thank you for the invitation." The conversation left Harper feeling a mix of pride and determination. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Maya's courage had sparked something bigger, and he was determined to see it through. That evening, Harper sat with Maya at the kitchen table. She was sketching again, her focus back on her art. Harper smiled as he watched her, relieved to see her finding joy again. "Maya," he said, breaking the silence, "I want you to know something. What you did, telling me what happened, it took a lot of courage. You're making a difference." Maya looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Do you think other kids will be safe because of this?" "Yes," Harper said firmly. "Because of you, we're making sure this doesn't happen again." Maya smiled, a look of pride spreading across her face. Harper felt a deep sense of gratitude. Despite the challenges, he knew they were on the right path, and together, they were creating a better future. The day of Officer Grant's hearing had arrived, and Captain Harper stood outside the precinct with Maya by his side. He had brought her along, not to relive the incident, but to show her how justice could prevail when people stood up for what was right. Maya held her sketchbook tightly, a small source of comfort as they prepared to walk inside. The precinct was bustling with activity, but the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had heard about the incident gave Harper respectful nods, while others avoided making eye contact. Harper remained composed, his focus on ensuring that justice would be served. As they entered the conference room where the hearing was being held, Maya's eyes darted around nervously. Harper gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. "Just tell the truth, like you did before." The hearing began with Officer Lopes presenting the evidence against Grant. Witness statements, security footage from the park, and Maya's account painted a clear picture of what had happened. Grant, sitting at the far end of the table, looked visibly uncomfortable as the details were laid out. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stood up bravely, her small frame dwarfed by the seriousness of the room. She described how she had been approached by Grant, how his questions made her uncomfortable, and how he had touched her without her consent. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she held her sketchbook. "I didn't know what to do," Maya said, looking directly at the panel of officers overseeing the hearing. "But I knew it wasn't right, and I'm glad my dad came when he did." The room was silent as her words sank in. Harper watched his daughter with pride, amazed at her courage. When she finished speaking, she returned to her seat, and Harper whispered, "You did great." The panel questioned Grant next, who tried to justify his actions as misunderstood intentions. But his excuses fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The panel didn't take long to reach their decision. "Officer Grant," one of the senior officers said sternly, "your behavior was inappropriate and a violation of the trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. Effective immediately, you are terminated from the force." A wave of relief washed over Harper and Maya. Justice had been served. The officers in the room, including Lopes, nodded in agreement, knowing this decision was necessary to uphold the integrity of the department. As they left the precinct, Maya looked up at her father. "Does this mean he won't hurt anyone else?" she asked. Harper nodded. "That's right, Maya. Because you spoke up, you stopped him from doing this to someone else." Maya smiled, and for the first time since the incident, she looked at peace. Harper felt a sense of accomplishment, not just as a captain, but as a father who had protected his daughter and stood for what was right. Together, they walked away, ready to move forward with hope for the future. After the hearing, the city seemed to take notice of what had happened. News of the incident spread, and Captain Harper's firm response became a story of accountability and justice. Harper, however, wasn't focused on the attention. For him, it was about doing what was right, not just for Maya, but for the entire community. A few days later, Harper received a call from Mrs. Evelyn Jones, the community leader who had reached out before. "Captain Harper," she said warmly, "your actions have inspired a lot of people. We're organizing a community forum to talk about building trust between the police and the public. We'd love for you and Maya to attend." Harper hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and he didn't want Maya to feel overwhelmed. But when he mentioned the idea to her, her eyes lit up. "Can I go, Dad?" Maya asked eagerly. "I want to tell people what happened. Maybe it'll help them feel brave too." Harper smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. You're already so brave." The forum was held in a large community center, packed with people of all ages. Harper and Maya sat near the front, watching as community leaders, police officers, and residents shared their thoughts and experiences. There were stories of pain and mistrust, but also of hope and a desire for change. When it was Harper's turn to speak, he stood up and addressed the crowd. "What happened to my daughter was unacceptable," he began. "As a police officer, I've sworn to protect and serve, but that promise means nothing if we don't hold ourselves accountable. It's up to all of us, officers and citizens alike, to create an environment where everyone feels safe." The crowd nodded in agreement, and Harper's words resonated deeply. Then, to his surprise, Maya raised her hand. "Can I say something too?" she asked. Harper smiled and nodded, helping her up to the microphone. The room grew quiet as Maya spoke. "I was scared when that officer wouldn't let me go," she said, her voice small but steady. But I told my dad, and he believed me. Because of that, we stopped something bad from happening again. The crowd erupted into applause, and Harper couldn't have been prouder. Maya's courage and honesty had touched everyone in the room, showing that even the smallest voice could make a difference. After the event, people approached Harper and Maya, thanking them for their bravery. Mrs. Jones pulled Harper aside and said, "You've not only changed the way people see the police, but you've also shown what it means to lead with integrity." Harper nodded humbly. "This isn't the end, though. We still have work to do." As they drove home that evening, Maya leaned back in her seat, a content smile on her face. "Dad, do you think other kids will feel safer now?" she asked. "I think so, Maya," Harper said, glancing at her proudly. "Because of you, a lot of people will feel safer, and that's just the beginning." Together, they looked forward to a brighter future, knowing that one act of courage had sparked meaningful change.